How does equity link with convergence? This question takes me back to my childhood when trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle, a search for how the many concepts, interventions and recommendations fit together. In one corner we have equity and in another convergence. But what do these pieces mean and how do they link? Let's begin with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Universality, non-discrimination and emphasis on the most disadvantaged. These are important starting points for policy and programming. For example, education for all goals cannot be reached without universality. But beyond these principles, when we ask what barriers and bottlenecks continue to keep poor children and families from obtaining their rights, we find inequities determined by poverty, gender, geography, ethnicity, disability, caste, language, religion, age, and so on. We discover national averages conceal large subnational disparities. Humanitarian crises, urbanization, climate change, and economic shocks deepen and widen these inequities. When we look at Nepal, we find more than a third of its 12.7 million children live in poverty. The poorest children are almost twice as likely to be married before the age of 18 as the richest. Net enrolment in primary schools is lowest amongst the poorest children. We find Dalit and Muslim women in the Terai are many times more likely to lose their newborn child than a Brahmin woman from the same region. Dropout and repetition rates are higher in rural compared to urban areas, suggesting problems with the quality of education, especially in rural schools. The country's poorest children are 2.5 times more likely to have a low weight for their age compared to the richest. We find working children and children being sexually exploited. We find children affected by armed conflict, by migration, trafficking, stigma related to HIV, harmful social norms and gender-based violence. We find poor governance, ineffective legislation, weak or even missing human resources, and inadequate investment. For example, only 17% of schools in Nepal have good toilets for girls. These are just some of the barriers and bottlenecks. But UNICEF's recent analysis has shown that compared to the current path towards the MDGs, an equity-focused approach would accelerate progress and is more cost-effective and sustainable. We have the packages. We have the innovations. We have cash transfer schemes. We must strengthen health systems. We have community outreach, for instance in Nepal, through a massive network of almost 50,000 female community health volunteers, 5,000 child clubs, and almost 1,000 paralegal committees. Nepal can achieve its MDGs with equity. What we need now is a comprehensive and coherent macro policy framework to reduce inequity. And this leads me to convergence. If equity is the goal, then perhaps convergence is the strategy. But what does convergence mean? Convergence comes from the Latin word convergere, to move toward an intersecting point from different directions, to achieve union or common consensus. In evolution, convergence is the process by which unrelated organisms acquire similar characteristics. For example, the remarkable similarities between auks, sea-diving birds in the northern hemisphere, and penguins in the southern hemisphere. I hope we can learn from each other about how, despite differing contexts, we have arrived at similar packages and common approaches. Scaling up and advocacy are made easier through such convergence of ideas. But divergence can also occur. In evolution, divergence happens when related organisms acquire different characteristics from living in different environments. Consider, for example, the desert-dwelling kit fox and the forest-dwelling red fox. Think the feet of a monkey and our own feet despite our common ancestry. Divergence can be a strength as long as it does not lead to disagreement. So I do hope creative divergence can be harnessed towards strengthening the equity agenda. To narrow the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, convergence must occur between and across interventions, between development sectors. For example, we know that early learning interventions contribute to equity in health outcomes. In programming, for example, Nepal's decentralized action for children and women, and between central and line ministries, donors, the private sector, and civil society. But there remains another definition of convergence, the most important piece to complete the jigsaw. Optical convergence refers to the act of coordinated movement of two eyes, so that the image of a single point is formed on corresponding retinal areas. In our debates and future endeavours, we must maintain focus on our central mandate. Children should be at the heart of our action. And she wishes you success in piecing together this jigsaw puzzle to connect equity with convergence.